Olivia Foster wasn't the kind of woman who made a scene, not even when she had every right to. That afternoon she didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't slam any doors. She just stood still in the hallway of the apartment she shared with Caleb, holding a black velvet box in her hand, staring at the silence that had grown too familiar. She already knew, not because someone had told her, but because sometimes the body understands things before the mind admits them. The signs weren't loud, but they were constant, like the way he laughed at his phone during dinner, or how he'd started calling her Liv in a tone that felt more like a habit than affection. The final blow came disguised as a joke in the group chat for their law faculty cohort. Something petty, mean, and far too specific. That was all it took. She didn't ask for an explanation. She didn't need one. She simply put the ring back in its box, left it neatly on his desk, and walked out. No message, no warning, just silence. Because sometimes silence is the loudest way to say goodbye. The next morning, Olivia got up before sunrise, showered in cold water, toasted old bread, drank coffee that tasted like resolve, and then she dressed in the most formal outfit she owned, a navy blue blazer that didn't quite fit, and shoes that pinched. She was starting a new internship that day, and it wasn't just any internship. She had been selected to assist at the Chicago Superior Court, one of the most prestigious placements in the state. It was the kind of opportunity that could change her career, but her heart wasn't in it yet. Not entirely. Her thoughts were still fractured, lingering somewhere between the betrayal she hadn't dared process and the life she was trying to build without it. When she arrived at the courthouse, she was ushered up to the 15th floor and into a private chamber where everything smelled like old wood and air conditioning. The judge's office was silent, blinds drawn, as if it too preferred to keep the light out. When the door opened, the man behind the desk didn't look up right away. He finished the sentence he was reading, then slowly raised his eyes. "Foster," he said, glancing at her badge. "That's your surname?" She nodded. "Yes, sir." "You're Olivia," she confirmed again. He gave a short nod and closed the folder in his hands. "Then you're the intern. And in here, that's all that matters." His voice was calm, but the air between them was not, because she already knew who he was. Andrew Sullivan, the judge, the man whose son she had just left behind. For the first few days, Olivia moved like a shadow through Judge Sullivan's chambers. She was punctual, respectful, and quiet. So quiet that sometimes people forgot she was even there. She listened more than she spoke, and made a habit of never inserting herself unless directly asked. Andrew treated her like he did every other intern. Strictly professional. No small talk, no unnecessary words. But beneath that formality, something was stirring, something he refused to name. It wasn't that she had once been his son's girlfriend. That part didn't bother him nearly as much as it should have. It was the way she carried herself, focused, understated, always just a little withdrawn. She wore plain dresses, her hair usually twisted into a quick, messy bun. She didn't fidget, she didn't overshare. And when she spoke, her words came out precise, measured, like she'd already gone over them a dozen times in her head. Andrew wasn't used to being affected by anyone in his professional space, least of all someone so young. But something about her presence disrupted the order of his days, and he didn't like that one bit. It wasn't until the third week that Olivia handed him a legal draft that stopped him cold. It was a detailed recommendation for an emergency custody petition, something he'd expected to edit line by line. But the document was flawless. Every citation, every argument, every nuance of tone was exactly right. He read it twice, just to be sure he hadn't imagined the precision. Then he closed the folder and looked up. "You wrote this on your own?" he asked. Olivia met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, sir." He nodded once. "It's very well done." "Thank you," she replied quietly. That was it. No smile, no further comment. But something shifted in the air between them. Andrew returned to his paperwork, but his mind stayed behind. That night, for the first time, he caught himself wondering who Olivia Foster really was. Not as an intern, not as Caleb's ex, but as a woman. And that thought, uninvited and unwanted, clung to him for the rest of the evening, like a scent he couldn't scrub away. Andrew Sullivan had spent his entire career building walls between himself and anything that could make him lose focus. He prided himself on being sharp, composed, and untouched by emotion, especially in court. But Olivia unsettled him in ways he couldn't name. It wasn't anything she did. It was how she simply was. She never vied for attention, never sought approval, yet somehow commanded both. He'd catch himself watching her when she wasn't aware, trying to understand what it was about her that pulled at something dormant in him. The way she leaned slightly forward when reading complex case files, the quiet intensity in her eyes, the subtle nod she gave when she understood something before it was explained. She reminded him of someone who had lived through more than she let on. One afternoon, while reviewing a phone call with a state prosecutor, he noticed she didn't turn to look at him once, but he knew she was listening. Her fingers paused on the keyboard every time he emphasized a legal point, as if committing it to memory. And it was in those little moments, when she was most unaware, that he felt the most thrown off. Their first real moment alone happened in the file room, of all places. It was late in the afternoon, the building half empty, and the air was thick with the kind of heat that clings to paper and skin. Olivia was crouched down, flipping through the archive shelves, looking for an old case file. Andrew walked in, searching for a completely different document. Neither expected the other. Their eyes met at the same time, hers alert, his unreadable. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly, starting to stand. "Of course," he replied, stepping to the side. She brushed past him with a file in her hands. "Good evening." "Evening, Olivia." He stood still as she walked away, still holding the wrong folder, completely unaware that he hadn't come for what he thought he had. He remained in that room for several minutes afterward, not even pretending to search. He just stood there, a man who had always been certain of who he was, now feeling like someone had knocked something loose inside of him, and he didn't know how to put it back. The following week, a formal visit was scheduled to the state's central judicial headquarters. A rotation was in place for interns to accompany presiding judges, and to no one's surprise, Olivia was selected to join Andrew. He didn't object. How could he? Her performance had been spotless. That morning, Olivia found him already in the driver's seat of a sleek black sedan parked in the courthouse garage. The windows were tinted, the interior clean and subdued. He didn't get out to open the door. She didn't expect him to. She climbed in, adjusted her purse on her lap, and greeted him with a polite, "Good morning." "Good morning," he replied, eyes still on the road ahead. For 10 minutes, they drove in silence, the rush hour traffic providing cover for the wait neither dared to acknowledge. Then his voice cut through it, low and measured. "Are you thinking of taking the bar exam?" She blinked at the unexpected question. "Yes, possibly criminal law or public defense." He nodded slowly, never glancing her way. "You have the profile for it. You see beyond the paperwork." It was the kind of comment that carried more than it revealed. She didn't answer. Instead, she stared out the window, watching the streets of the city slip past, trying to steady her breath. There was something about his voice that morning, like he was speaking more to himself than to her. When they arrived, Andrew reminded her to mind the step as she opened the car door. "It's steep," he warned. She looked back at him surprised. "Thank you. I don't say much unless it matters," he replied. Then, without waiting, he walked ahead. Inside, the visit passed in a blur of formalities, tours, and introductions. Olivia was focused, professional as always, but her thoughts kept returning to that car ride, to the comment he made, and the quiet way he looked at her without ever actually looking at her. Later, on the drive back, he asked if she wanted coffee. She said yes. "No sugar, right?" he asked, reaching for the thermos in the console. She paused. "How do you know that?" He handed her the cup without looking. "I notice the things you don't say." For the rest of the ride, neither of them spoke, but something had shifted, like two people suddenly aware they were standing on the edge of something neither had planned for, something neither could fully name. That night, Olivia stayed later than usual at the office. The building was nearly empty, the hallways quiet except for the occasional sound of a printer or a distant conversation between clerks. She had just finished revising a complex civil litigation summary when Andrew stepped into the doorway of her workspace. The lights were dim in the adjoining chambers, casting long shadows across the polished floor. He didn't say anything at first, just held a file in his hand, then walked it over to her desk. "Here's the case you requested," he said, his voice softer than usual. She took it from him, their fingers briefly touching. "Thank you." She looked up, expecting him to leave, but he didn't. Instead, he watched her for a moment longer than was necessary. "You're talented, Olivia. Far more than you realize." She opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught somewhere in her throat. Before she could find them, He stepped back, then stopped. "Were you always like this?" he asked quietly. "Like what?" "Held together, reserved." She lowered her eyes, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "I guess so." The air thickened with a tension neither of them dared to name. Andrew's hand hovered for a second, then lifted. To her jaw, her shoulder, her hair, she wasn't sure, but it dropped back to his side before making contact. "Good night," he said, and disappeared down the hallway before she could answer. But it was already too late for both of them. The pull between them had gone from a flicker to something that felt dangerously close to real. Days passed, but the memory of that moment lingered like the scent of paper and cologne. Andrew tried to bury himself in court opinions and legal filings, but her presence was everywhere, in the scent of her shampoo that lingered in the file room, in the way she tucked her pen behind her ear, in the simple, infuriating stillness she carried. And Olivia, she wasn't immune either. She caught herself watching the door whenever she heard his footsteps. Her hands trembled when she reached for files he had touched. She hated herself for it, but her body was already writing a truth her mind was too afraid to admit. They avoided being alone for the rest of the week, sticking to routine, letting professionalism do the talking. But even that had its limits, because you can only pretend for so long. And when pretending becomes harder than surrendering, something always gives. The unraveling came on a Friday, almost like it had been waiting for the week to end. The courthouse was quieter than usual, a few clerks already gone for the weekend. Olivia was the last intern left, still reviewing motions when Andrew stepped into the intern's support room unannounced. He wasn't in his usual suit, just a button-down shirt, open at the collar, and a blazer casually draped over one shoulder. His gaze met hers, unreadable, but intentional. "Can you leave a little early today?" he asked. She hesitated, heart already racing. "Yes, I think so. I need to talk to you," he said, not offering more. There was no discussion of where or why. She followed him without questioning, though everything in her was trembling. The drive was short, silent. They arrived at a discreet boutique hotel nestled between high-rises, muted colors, soft lighting, the kind of place built to disappear into the city. When he unlocked the door to the suite, she paused at the threshold. Inside, there was a soft beige sofa, a bottle of wine open on the counter, and a heavy silence sitting between them. "I told myself I'd forget what happened," he began, leaning against the wall, arms folded across his chest. "But I haven't. I can't." Olivia didn't move. "And what do you want now?" she asked. "You," he said, with a certainty that scared her more than she cared to admit. The moment felt suspended, the kind of stillness that only comes before everything changes. She didn't answer right away, not out of hesitation, but because she wanted to be sure she wasn't mistaking loneliness for permission. "Not because of Caleb?" she asked quietly. "Not because of what happened?" He stepped closer. "Not because of anyone but you. I lost my peace the day you walked into my office." There was no heat in his voice, just truth. She didn't run. She didn't retreat. She just looked at him, like she was seeing him for the first time. Not as a judge, not as her boss, not as Caleb's father, but as a man carrying too many years of solitude in his eyes. He reached for her gently, almost like asking a question without words. His fingers brushed her jaw first, then her lips. She closed her eyes, and that was all the answer he needed. The kiss came next, slow, then urgent. A release, a reckoning. His hands found her waist, her shoulders, her hair, moving as if trying to memorize the shape of something forbidden. Olivia let herself be held, kissed, undone. They weren't thinking about titles or consequences. In that moment, they were just two people who had been alone for far too long, finally choosing not to be. They didn't talk much after that. There weren't words for what had just happened, what they had allowed to happen. Olivia sat on the edge of the bed, the sheet pulled up to her chest, staring at the muted city lights through the window. Andrew stood nearby, already half-dressed again, his back to her as he buttoned his shirt with slow, deliberate movements. Neither of them knew what to say. What could you say after crossing that kind of line? Eventually, he turned around, his expression unreadable but not cold. "This shouldn't have happened," he murmured, his voice hoarse. Olivia nodded slowly, eyes still on the skyline. "I know, but it had." And the silence that followed didn't erase it. If anything, it deepened it. He stepped toward her, paused as if reconsidering, then sat on the armchair across from the bed. "I need time," he said finally, "to think, to figure out what this means." She didn't argue. She didn't ask for anything. She just nodded again, as if already expecting that answer. When they left, they didn't touch, didn't exchange promises, just a quiet, mutual understanding that nothing would ever be the same. The days that followed were filled with avoidance and restraint. At the courthouse, Andrew became more formal than ever, neutral to the point of discomfort. He didn't linger, didn't glance in her direction, didn't say anything beyond what was strictly necessary. But Olivia saw the tension in his shoulders, the hesitation in his steps when she was near. And she felt it too, like a hum in the air that neither of them could silence. She buried herself in work, leaving as soon as she could, pretending everything was normal. Except it wasn't. At night, she stared at her ceiling, remembering the weight of his hands, the look in his eyes, the way his voice cracked when he whispered her name. She hated that her heart still beat faster when she thought of him. She hated that she didn't regret it, but more than anything, she feared what came next, because she knew what kind of man he was, private, composed, protective of his reputation, and she was the scandal waiting to happen. Olivia didn't answer his texts. She ignored his missed calls. It wasn't out of pride. It was fear. Fear of falling harder. Fear of getting hurt again. Fear that this time, she wouldn't know how to pick up the pieces. Andrew tried to respect her silence. He truly did. But the absence of her had carved a hollow in his routine he couldn't fill. He'd wake up already thinking of her, sit through meetings while catching glimpses of people who only reminded him of her posture, her voice, her scent. Once he passed by the intern's workroom and instinctively looked toward the corner desk, empty. She had taken her scheduled leave, but he knew that wasn't all. She was avoiding him, and the part that tore at him most was knowing he couldn't blame her. He was her boss, older, her ex's father. Everything about what had happened was wrong by conventional standards, but nothing about it had felt wrong in the moment. When he tried calling her again, just once more, the line rang until voicemail. He didn't leave a message. He just sat in his office afterward, fingers steepled against his lips, wondering what kind of man he really was now. The kind who took what he wanted and watched it disappear, or the kind who could finally face the truth of what he wanted and be brave enough to claim it. Meanwhile, Olivia wasn't just avoiding him. She was battling her own unraveling. What began as fatigue turned into nausea, then dizziness. At first, she thought it was stress, the emotional toll of everything finally catching up. But when her period didn't come, the spiral started. She told no one. Not Talita, her roommate, not her mother, not even herself, not really. It wasn't denial. It was fear, pure and blinding. Fear of the possibility, fear of the consequence. On a gray Thursday afternoon, she walked into a local women's clinic with her hands shaking and her thoughts racing. The test was quick, the result undeniable. She was pregnant, and the ultrasound? Twins, 2 heartbeats flickering like whispers of a future she wasn't ready for. She walked out of the room, stunned, found a bench outside near the steps, and just sat there. For minutes, maybe longer. The city moved around her, but her world had stopped. There was no plan, no precedent, just 2 lives growing inside her, and a silence she didn't know how to break. Olivia didn't go back to the courthouse, not even to pack her things. Instead, she drafted a short, formal resignation letter, polite, professional, devoid of any personal explanation. She thanked the team for the opportunity and wished them well. That was it. No drama. No trace of the storm brewing beneath her skin. She submitted the letter through the administrative portal and turned the page on that chapter as cleanly as she could. It wasn't an act of pride. It was protection. For her, for them, for the 2 heartbeats that now shaped every decision she made. Within a week, she had taken a modest legal assistant position at a small neighborhood law office. Less pay, fewer hours, but enough to keep moving. She split rent with Talita, traded rideshare apps for buses, and scheduled prenatal appointments through public clinics. She bought a folder to organize her test results, took vitamins, and kept her head down. She didn't tell Andrew, not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't know how. She was afraid of what she'd see in his eyes if she did. Regret, disappointment, shame. She couldn't risk it. Not now, when every ounce of her strength was spoken for. But fate, as it often does, had its own timing. Olivia returned to the courthouse once, just once, to drop off a signed release form for her final internship stipend. She wore a loose gray dress, tied gently above the waist, and a cardigan despite the early heat. She thought she'd be invisible, that no one would notice the small, unmistakable curve of her stomach. She kept her eyes low, her steps quiet. But someone did notice. Caleb. He was standing near the clerk's station, joking with a colleague when his gaze fell on her. For a moment, he froze. Then his eyes traveled downward, slowly, until they landed on the truth. Her belly. Round. Undeniable. The smirk on his face wasn't confusion. It was calculation. And just like that, he turned and walked straight toward his father's office, not saying a word to her. Olivia didn't stop him. She couldn't. She just kept walking, pretending she didn't feel her heart trying to climb into her throat, because in that instant, she knew. The silence was about to be shattered, and there was no going back. Andrew was deep into a case review when the door to his office swung open without warning. He looked up, irritation flashing for a second, until he saw Caleb standing there. His son's jaw was tight, his eyes burning with a mixture of disbelief and something far more dangerous. Triumph. "We need to talk," Caleb said, not waiting for permission. Andrew leaned back, closing the folder in front of him, already sensing that whatever was coming next wouldn't be about court business. "It's Olivia," Caleb said, arms crossed, voice tight with accusation. Andrew didn't flinch, but a slow pulse began at his temple. "She's pregnant." The words fell heavy in the room, like bricks through glass. Andrew didn't speak, didn't blink. He just stared. "I saw her, just now. It's obvious. She didn't even try to hide it." Caleb's tone shifted, laced with spite now. "And it's not mine. That ended months ago, remember?" Andrew felt something seize inside him, a stillness that wasn't calm but survival. "And here's the fun part," Caleb added with a cold laugh. "If it's not mine, whose could it be?" He took a step forward. "Want to guess, Dad?" Andrew didn't answer. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes gave him away before his mouth could catch up. Caleb's smirk twisted. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "You're going to be a father again? To twins? With her?" Andrew's hands were clenched on the armrests of his chair, but his voice was steady. "Don't turn this into something cruel." "It already is something cruel," Caleb spat. "She was mine. She was never yours," Andrew said calmly, but the words struck like thunder. Caleb scoffed, shook his head, and walked out without another word. The silence that followed was louder than the confrontation itself. Andrew sat alone in the echo of it, the weight of the truth settling across his chest like wet cement. He had imagined this moment countless times, what he would do, what he would say, but none of it had prepared him for the sound of his own son confirming what he hadn't had the courage to ask Olivia himself. She was carrying his children, and he hadn't even known. Later that same afternoon, Andrew found himself walking through the courthouse courtyard, though he had no idea how he'd gotten there. His legs moved on instinct, his heart pounding against his ribs like it was trying to outrun his chest. Then, through the side exit near the old iron gate, he saw her, Olivia. She was walking with that same careful, measured stride he remembered. Only now, her hands cradled her belly unconsciously, like she was already used to protecting what was inside. "Olivia," he called out. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. She stopped, slowly turning toward him. Her eyes held a mix of calm and terror, like someone who had rehearsed 1,000 versions of this moment but still didn't feel ready. He walked toward her, trying to read the expression on her face. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice a little rougher than he intended. "You're pregnant?" She didn't respond with words. She just nodded, eyes glistening. Andrew's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Is it mine?" Another nod. Smaller this time. The kind you make when your voice is stuck in your throat. He took a step back, almost stumbling. Not because he was ashamed, but because he was overwhelmed. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. She took a breath, and for a second, it looked like she might not speak. But then the words came, steady but soft. "Because I thought you'd look at me the way Caleb did. Like a mistake, like something that could ruin everything you built." Her voice cracked at the end, but she didn't look away. "I couldn't stand the idea of seeing that in your eyes." Andrew's chest tightened. "Olivia," she shook her head. "I wasn't trying to hide from you. I was protecting myself, and them. Because I don't just carry one life, Andrew. I carry two." The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. Twins? He repeated, stunned. She nodded again, this time with a hint of fear behind her eyes. Andrew covered his mouth with one hand, trying to take it all in. You're carrying 2 of my children, and going through all of this alone? She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The answer was in the dark circles beneath her eyes, in the way her body leaned slightly to one side from the weight she bore, in the silence that had stretched between them for weeks. And in that moment, something in him broke, something that had kept him walled off for years. He reached for her hand, held it tight, and didn't say a word. Because for the first time, words weren't enough. Andrew didn't let go of her hand. Not immediately. He just stood there, his fingers wrapped gently around hers, like if he loosened his grip, she might disappear again. Let me be here, he said finally, his voice hushed but steady. Not as a judge, not even as the man who messed everything up by waiting too long. Just let me be the father. Let me be someone they can count on. Olivia looked up at him, her eyes swimming with something between disbelief and longing. She hadn't expected this. Not this softness, not this presence. She tried to hold herself together, but something cracked. The tears came before she could stop them. Quiet at first, then shuddering, and he didn't move. He didn't flinch. He just stepped closer, wrapped his arms around her shoulders, and let her cry into his chest in the middle of the courtyard, in full view of the world. But it didn't matter, because this wasn't about appearances anymore. This was about finally choosing to show up. For her, for the children, for the life they hadn't planned but had somehow built anyway. The days that followed weren't full of grand declarations or sweeping gestures. Andrew didn't storm back into her life with promises and flowers. He didn't need to. What he did instead was show up, in every small, unglamorous way that mattered. He texted once, then again, but never pushed when she didn't answer. He called her doctor's office to ask about appointments, but never showed up uninvited. And when he finally asked to see her, just to talk, she said yes. They met in a quiet park not far from where she now worked. Olivia wore flats and a loose sundress, her belly even more visible now. Andrew brought a folder with printed names and apartment listings. He didn't say move in with me or let's be a family. He just handed her the papers and said, I found something, if you want to see it. She was hesitant, unsure of what stepping into his world again might cost her. But she went. And when the elevator opened and she stepped into that apartment, modest but warm, sunlight spilling through the windows, 2 small cribs already assembled with care, it was like her breath caught in her throat. Andrew didn't follow her around the space. He let her take it in at her own pace. When she finally turned to look at him, her voice was barely a whisper. You did all this? He nodded. For them. For you. For us. If that's something you still want. And for the first time in weeks, Olivia didn't feel afraid. She walked slowly through the apartment, touching the edges of the cribs with a reverence that almost brought her to her knees. On the walls were soft watercolor prints of stars and skies. A small bookshelf had already been filled with children's books, their titles spelling out words like bravery, kindness, and belonging. In the corner, a rocking chair sat with a folded knit blanket draped over the arm, its gentle presence more meaningful than any bouquet. Olivia didn't speak. She couldn't. Her throat was too tight, her heart too full. She turned toward Andrew, who stood silently by the doorway, unsure whether to step closer or stay where he was. I thought I'd have to do all of this alone, she whispered finally, her voice fragile. You don't, he said, voice rough. Not anymore. She crossed the room slowly, stopped just a few feet from him. I'm still scared, Andrew. So am I, he replied. But maybe that means we care enough to try. She nodded, wiping a tear with the back of her hand. There were no fireworks, no sweeping romantic declarations. Just a quiet understanding that whatever came next, they'd face it side by side. In the weeks that followed, Olivia didn't move in immediately, but she started spending more time there. Not out of obligation, but out of trust. Something they were slowly rebuilding, piece by piece. Andrew learned how to brew her favorite tea, how to track her prenatal appointments, how to be present without being overbearing. He didn't ask about Caleb, and she didn't volunteer anything. That chapter, whatever it was, had closed. Their focus was here now, on what they were creating, not what had broken them. One evening, after returning from a checkup, they stopped by a bookstore at Andrew's suggestion. He wandered off into the children's section, running his fingers across rows of books until he found two, one about honesty, the other about courage. "For them," he said, holding them up, "so they know they were born from something real." Olivia looked at him, heart swelling. In that moment, surrounded by the smell of paper and the hush of pages turning, she felt something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Safe, not because everything was perfect, but because for the first time, nothing had to be. They weren't in love in the storybook sense. Not yet. Maybe not ever in that clean, easy way. But what they had was something steadier, an intimacy born not just from touch, but from shared silence, daily choices, and the raw vulnerability of building something in uncertain territory. Their evenings became rituals. She'd fold baby clothes while he made simple dinners. Sometimes they'd sit in the living room, music low, his hand resting on her belly as they felt the twins shift beneath her skin. Once, while setting the table, she found a small ring box on the kitchen counter. Nothing flashy, no grand speech. Inside, two thin silver bands sat side by side. "I know we already live like a family," Andrew said gently, "but I want us to choose it. Not because we have to, but because we believe in it." Olivia stared at the rings, her heart a riot of feelings. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for his hand, her fingers threading through his. "Okay," she whispered, eyes shining. "Let's choose it." The kiss that followed wasn't rushed or burning. It was quiet, whole, the kind that feels like breathing after holding it in for too long. That night, they made love for the first time since everything had changed. Not like the last time, charged and desperate, but slow, tender, reverent. There was no hurry, no pretense, just them, together, fully present. Andrew traced her body like it was a story he wanted to memorize. Olivia responded with the same intention. No walls, no hesitation. For the first time, it didn't feel like they were doing something forbidden. It felt like home. Afterward, they lay wrapped in the quiet glow of the bedside lamp, her head resting on his shoulder, their fingers still laced together. "I want this," he said softly. "You, them, the mess, all of it." Olivia smiled against his skin, not because she finally believed in fairy tales, but because this messy, imperfect, deeply human love was better than any fiction she'd ever read. And as sleep began to tug at their edges, the weight of fear gave way to something else, something that sounded a lot like peace. The delivery came early on a calm Sunday morning, as if the world itself had paused in anticipation. The sky outside was soft, painted in pale blues and quiet clouds. Olivia clutched Andrew's hand in the hospital room, her breaths coming fast but steady, her body exhausted but determined. Andrew never left her side, not even for a second. Dressed in scrubs, hair tucked under a cap, he whispered calm words she wouldn't remember later, but that somehow held her together in the moment. When the first cry echoed through the room, his heart cracked wide open. And when the second cry followed, another voice, another heartbeat, he looked at her through a blur of tears and smiled like he never had before. Two boys, two beginnings. The nurse placed one baby in each of his arms, and for a moment, the rest of the world disappeared. He looked down at their tiny faces, eyes closed, fists curled, and then up at Olivia, who watched him from the hospital bed, her face damp with tears, her chest rising with fragile breaths. "They're perfect," he whispered. "They're everything." Back in the maternity room, the soft hum of machines and the faint light from the window created a quiet cocoon around them. One baby slept peacefully in the bassinet beside Olivia's bed. The other rested in Andrew's arms as he rocked slowly in the corner chair. He stared at the newborn's face, still awestruck, still not fully believing that these lives were real. His. Olivia, propped up on pillows, watched him with a quiet smile that carried every emotion words could never hold. "We still need names," she said gently. He looked up, then back at the sleeping baby in his arms. "I've been thinking about that." She raised an eyebrow, curious. "You have?" He nodded. "I want one of them to be Lucas. The other, Raphael." She blinked, caught off guard by the certainty in his voice. "Why those?" He smiled, a slow, grounded smile. "Because they're names of healing, of starting over." She nodded, her throat tight, her chest full. "Lucas and Raphael," she repeated softly, as if speaking them made them more real. And in that moment, with the boys swaddled nearby and the weight of the world temporarily suspended, Something inside her finally settled. For the first time in a long while, Olivia didn't feel like she was surviving. She felt like she was home. That afternoon, their little hospital room turned into a revolving door of emotion. Talita arrived first, loud, cheerful, a burst of energy in the quiet calm. She held a bouquet of wildflowers in one hand and a box of chocolates in the other, and the moment she laid eyes on the babies, her smile cracked wide open. "I'm officially the godmother, right? I need it in writing," she joked, even as her eyes welled with tears. She kissed Olivia's forehead with the kind of tenderness that only years of friendship can hold, then turned to Andrew with a playful but respectful nod. Nice to finally meet the man behind the plot twist. Olivia laughed, really laughed, for the first time in what felt like months. Then her mother came, quieter, more reserved, but no less moved. She walked slowly to the bassinet, her fingers trembling slightly as she reached to touch Lucas's cheek. "They have your eyes," she said softly to Olivia, before glancing up at Andrew with the kind of look that said more than words ever could. Gratitude, relief, maybe even forgiveness. And for a while, everything felt simple. The weight of decisions, timelines, and heartbreaks faded into the background, replaced by the present, by the two tiny lives that had already changed everything. But nothing shocked Olivia more than the knock that came at sunset. When the door opened and Caleb stepped inside, she stiffened instinctively, her breath catching in her throat. He looked different, less smug, more uncertain. In his hands was a small bouquet of daisies, clearly picked up last minute. He didn't walk in with entitlement. He paused, like someone unsure whether they were welcome. His eyes flicked to the babies, then to Olivia, then to Andrew, who had just returned from washing a bottle at the sink. "They're beautiful," Caleb said, voice low. Andrew didn't speak. Neither did Olivia. She watched him carefully, not out of anger, but out of self-preservation. Caleb finally looked at her, really looked at her, and said, "I'm sorry for everything. I didn't know how much I hurt you." His words weren't dramatic. They were simple, honest. Olivia didn't respond right away, but then she nodded, just once, a gesture of peace, not reconciliation. Caleb stepped closer to the bassinet and looked down at his newborn half-brothers. "Welcome to the chaos, little guys," he murmured. Then, without another word, he turned and left. It wasn't closure, but it was enough. Sometimes a door doesn't need to slam to close, it just needs to quietly click shut. The months that followed moved fast, but Olivia and Andrew found their rhythm in the chaos. Mornings were a blur of diaper changes, warm bottles, and sleepy kisses. Nights were quiet battles against exhaustion, softened by shared glances and the hum of lullabies in the dim light of the nursery. There were hard days, of course, days when the twins wouldn't stop crying, when Olivia felt like a stranger in her own body, when Andrew came home drained from court and too tired to speak. But there was also laughter, small, sacred laughter, like when Raphael sneezed and startled himself, or when Lucas smiled in his sleep for the first time, and they both cried over it like fools. Olivia had never imagined this version of life. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but it was hers. Every moment she spent rocking her sons, every time Andrew pressed a tired kiss to her temple while holding one of them close, reminded her that even the most unexpected love stories can grow roots, deep, stubborn, and real. One Saturday, Olivia found Andrew sitting on the grass outside their building, both boys in his lap, their tiny fists clinging to his t-shirt. The morning sun lit up his face in a way she hadn't seen before. Soft, almost boyish, like something inside him had finally unraveled. She approached quietly, 2 mugs of coffee in her hands. He looked up as she sat beside him and smiled, the kind of smile that didn't ask for anything in return. "They're asleep," he whispered, as if afraid to break the moment. She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "You're really good at this," she said. "No one ever taught me how to be a father," he replied, eyes on the twins. "I just know I don't want to miss a second of it." They stayed there in silence. No plans, no rush, just the sound of wind in the trees and the weight of 2 tiny breathing miracles anchoring them to the present. It wasn't perfection, but it was peace. And after everything they'd been through, that peace felt like the rarest kind of love. That night, after the twins had been fed and tucked into their cribs, Olivia stood in the doorway of the nursery and just watched them. Their soft breaths, The faint flutter of their eyelids, the way they instinctively turned their faces toward each other in sleep. It was a kind of magic no one could prepare you for. Behind her, Andrew stepped into the room, wrapping his arms gently around her waist. They didn't speak at first. They didn't need to. The room was filled with the quiet hum of a family that had been formed not out of perfect plans, but out of courage, forgiveness, and the willingness to stay when things got hard. "I still don't know how we ended up here," Olivia said softly, her voice almost swallowed by the warmth of the moment. Andrew rested his chin on her shoulder. "We didn't end up here," he said. "We chose this. Every single day we kept choosing it." She turned toward him, their faces close. And for the first time since that first night months ago, she saw him not as the man who had once scared her with his silence, but as the man who had made space for her to heal, and for them to grow, and for love to take root in all the broken places. Later, as they lay in bed with the soft glow of the bedside lamp painting shadows on the wall, Olivia reached for his hand, their fingers intertwined, a perfect match in the quiet. "Do you think they'll ever understand how much we fought to become this?" she asked, half laughing, half aching. Andrew looked at her, his eyes softer than she'd ever seen them. "Maybe not, but they'll feel it, in the way we love them, in the way we love each other." She smiled, tears prickling the corners of her eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming feeling that she had arrived. After all the detours, after all the moments she thought she was broken beyond repair, she was here, with him, with them. And in the soft, still silence of that night, with the city just beyond their windows and two tiny souls asleep across the hall, Olivia Foster realized something she would carry for the rest of her life. Sometimes the most forbidden love becomes the one that saves you, and sometimes it doesn't matter how the story starts. What matters is who chooses to stay until the end.